Our next panel will be led by Pat Fiacco, the Business Development Manager for Carbon RX, based right here in Saskatchewan. Pat has served as the Mayor of Regina previously for 12 years, and I can say has built a reputation for Indigenous inclusion. Of course, the locals will know that he spearheaded the I Love Regina Day, and we always enjoyed the enthusiasm that Pat brought to the office. He's done the same thing in terms of understanding the importance of bringing together 150 million acres of First Nations land to be able to represent the largest force in climate change and climate change reduction in North America and perhaps even in the world. I want to say as well that after politics, Pat started his own company, the Fiacco Management Group, which focused on the economic development of First Nations. So he has great learnings in terms of First Nations economic development, and he has learnings about how to bring people together. With that, I'd like to have Pat Fiacco come to the stage.
Okay, we're on. Yeah, and can you turn the main mic off on the podium? Because I think there's some feedback. Need a step from my... Tells you why I didn't have a successful basketball career. Hello? Okay, we're good. Well, thank you very much, Lionel. I'm going to be introducing a couple of gentlemen that are going to be on the panel here. I'll start off with Jason Rasevych. Jason is a partner at Deloitte Canada and national leader of the Indigenious services team. Jason Rasevych is a Anishinaabe from Ginnungagin First Nation and partner at Deloitte Canada. Jason is the national leader of the Indigenious services team and leads Deloitte's Indigenous Wealth Management service line, which works to support First Nations and trustees in managing approximately $1 billion in investment funds. Jason's knowledge of economic development on First Nations will strengthen this discussion that we're going to have on ESG investing. So please give a warm applause to Jason. Andrew, come on up. You don't need something you can, he's tall, isn't he? Andrew Hall is the Managing Director of Carbon Markets Advisory, Sustainable Finance and Corporate Transitions, and TD Services or Securities. Andrew has over 15 years of experience in environmental commodities, helping build out successful businesses within the financial services and energy sectors. Prior to joining TD, Andrew was responsible for sustainable finance strategy, products, and platforms at TMX Group and led the North American environmental commodities business at Capital Power. Please welcome Andrew Hall. Before we get started on the discussion, I do want to introduce our former Speaker of the House at the Saskatchewan Legislature. He's a current sitting MLA with the provincial government SAS Party. Please give a welcome to Mark Docherty. Thanks for being here, Mark. So let's get started, gentlemen. Are we ready? And I'll ask each of you this question. And the first one is, can you tell me what ESG investing means in the industry that you're in today?
Sure.
Yeah, I think you're on.
Okay. Yeah, the industry for ESG, there's some trends that are happening, and some of it is being established through legislative drivers related to nature-based carbon solutions. I'll focus more of my points on nature-based carbon solutions and maybe specifically some key pointers with carbon. But there are companies now and investors that are taking the socially responsible investment route and looking at where investments are being supported by First Nations communities. And this is very important to the concept of sustainable finance, to reducing risk in the investment portfolio that companies are looking at. And it also is influencing the investment policy related to how these investments are being made. Hearing Bob Ray speak, I recall working with him a number of years, within the Matawa file and project, and that's come a long way with UNDRIP. But I also acknowledge comments that are being made by leaders regarding UNDRIP and FPIC, and going back to honoring the foundations of the treaties. When I think of bringing it back to setting the tone on ESG, I've heard leaders say, sure, we've got some legislative drivers there to have some discussions on, be able to advance some of the concepts of ESG and UNDRIP and FPIC, but there are nations that have a nation-to-nation agreement based on treaty, and that acknowledgement should also be discussed. My nation, Ganugaming, is signatory James Bay Treaty Number 9. I also notice one of my colleagues, Albalina here from Mushkegowuk Development Corporation, also in that area. And many of the treaties do have similar types of tones or language related to land restoration or land preservation and protecting of First Nation rights, First Nation ancestral inherent rights and responsibilities. And part of that is an evergreen statement, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. When treaties were signed, we didn't think we'd have the discussion on the air, on the carbon, but it does have impacts related to nations. And many of the issues that we see today regarding barriers to advancing First Nations positions in the carbon offsets are due to jurisdiction, are due to lands, rights, and title. And the more opportunity to, I guess we'll get into some of that discussion on some recommendations later on in this segment, but the more that First Nations are raising awareness, are educating their own communities, and also developing positions on where they stand related to nature-based climate solutions is very important to do. So to circle back to the question, it has major impacts on investors, lenders, First Nations as potential suppliers, and also the buyers across corporate Canada that are responding to climate change disclosures, also Indigenous relations disclosures, which are going to be a point in the future related response to certain policies they may have into place around those treaties or around FPIC or UNDRIP, and how companies could do a better job to work in collaboration with nations and in advancing carbon or nature-based climate solutions.
Thanks, Jason. And Andrew, again, ESG investing in your industry, what does that mean?
Sure. Thanks, Pat, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all here today about carbon markets. I mean, ESG broadly thought of as an umbrella term under which carbon markets and carbon offsets sit, touches every single part of the capital markets and financial markets. At this point, you'll be very hard-pressed to find large institutional investors and increasingly smaller investors down to the retail level that don't take into account some sort of consideration of ESG. And that's not just climate change, that's social and governance. It's not pure ESG altruism or environmental altruism. What they're finding then is incorporating ESG considerations into investment decisions can lead to better performance. I'd say the jury's still out to a certain extent on that, but those are some of the general trends. As it relates to carbon markets, the carbon markets and the development of them has been quite interesting. From my perspective, I've been involved in the market since about 2006. The markets themselves are not new. They're new to a lot of people just because they've gained prominence in the last couple of years, and particularly coming out of the pandemic, but they've been around for over 30 years, particularly the voluntary market the compliance markets, particularly in EU, which are by far the largest carbon markets right now, compliance carbon market. Then you had ESG investing probably in the last 10 to 12 years. And now what you're seeing is the convergence of ESG investing and the carbon markets. And that convergence is a result of corporates in large part starting to make net zero commitments. So starting to say, hey, we are going to start to put ourselves on that lower carbon trajectory. And typically the easiest and first step that they take to start to get on that trajectory is the use of offsets while they explore longer term, more permanent reductions along the lines of what Fiona from BHP mentioned earlier. And so that's where you're starting to see increasingly investors looking to purchase offsets, corporates looking to purchase offsets, sovereigns. There's 120 sovereigns that have made net zero commitments in line with their Paris Agreement commitments, who are starting to look at the offset market. And as a result, you're seeing investors follow suit, and we're seeing large pools of institutional capital that are looking to invest in the carbon markets in a way that quite simply hasn't been the case in the past. And so it's no longer, before there really just wasn't any money, frankly, and now it's billions from private equity, from sovereign wealth funds, from increasingly public markets that are exploring the carbon markets and starting to place capital in them. One of the interesting areas, I think, for this audience is just the interest in nature-based solutions, which are typically land-based terrestrial offset type projects like forestry and agriculture. So I think when you start to think about the equitable distribution of the benefits from the growth of that market, the traditional stewards of that land, First Nations and such, I think will be key partners as we see that market grow and start to scale.
So you talked a bit about getting First Nations involved into the carbon offset market. Can you be more specific? And I'm gonna ask you the same question, Jason. What are some things that can be done in respect to that?
So as it relates to Canada specifically, right, when you look at land ownership, the vast majority is Crown land. So there's very little private land or privately managed land then that is eligible for the creation of offset projects. And I believe, I don't know the stat, but I believe a large chunk of that is held by First Nations. And therefore, as companies are starting to look to forestry projects, for example, really they need to form some sort of partnership with the stewards of those lands in order to deploy the capital to either purchase the land or develop the offset project with those folks.
Thank you. Jason, any further comment on First Nations getting into the carbon offset market?
Yeah, I guess I could build on the first comment on awareness and education and having more dialogue at the community level, perhaps integrating the discussion within the Lands and Resource Department in each of the community, or specifically maybe a councillor that has that portfolio, whether it's in the environmental or lands and resource or in the economic development. But definitely it should be a topic that should be discussed. Communities should be working on planning for the future generations. And part of the challenge that we see with the market, that when my colleague explains how long it's been and how mature it is at this point, even though there's some new discoveries related to how we should move forward, is First Nations are somewhat reacting to what's being done, and being more proactive will better position the nations to play a key role, potentially as a supplier, and then building it into new agreements. And if there's opportunity to discuss existing agreements with potential buyers, of having that in the specific chapter related to first right of refusal is important, related to consent-based agreement making when certain companies are coming on First Nations traditional lands, to be able to include certain components of potential providing nature-based climate solutions or that discussion. The other is, of course, asserting jurisdiction. That difficult to do across different provinces that may have a different view on the carbon market or the offset area. We see BC with being more advanced with its offset system. Federally, there's a protocol that's being developed that support a First Nation view on forest management adaptation. But there are certain provinces that are still behind related to supporting some of those development. And then when we think about, well, what about wetlands restoration and so forth, there's challenges there to have a certain criteria in place to be eligible. So the more a nation is bringing this up in the community dialogue, that it's part of the land planning process for the community, and that potentially there's collaboration there amongst overlapping areas, or to work regionally or potential provincially to potentially supply the available carbon that's there, and to have more leverage in some of those discussions. So a few ideas there.
Thank you. Andrew, as far as trends go right now, what trends do you see occurring?
I mean, just a lot of capital flowing into the space, quite simply, and a real focus on, again, nature-based solutions. And as it relates to Canada, forestry is a big one. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, first and foremost, it's about, in the case of forestry, but also agriculture, it's about removals. So as the forest grows, it continues to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's important. But the other thing too then is investors are starting to look at co-benefits, which was mentioned in one of the earlier sessions. And co-benefits are, watershed protection. As one example, you've got biodiversity, flora and fauna, and the like, and buyers are increasingly attracted to that, in addition to the actual removals that might take place. There's different types of forestry projects, and there's different types of agricultural products that are out there. But that's where we're seeing, significant capital being, invested in is those types of projects. We ourselves just invested in a forestry project in Ontario. We made the announcement 2 weeks ago, $10 million in partnership with the Nature Conservancy of Canada to invest in the Boreal Wildlands project. That is going to be, it's a 30-year deal that then allows the Conservation Fund to go out and purchase the land and put that into a conservation easement such that it's there in perpetuity, whereas the base case scenario was that would have been sort of industrial forest that would have been logged. It was purchased from a timber company, Domtar. So as one example that we ourselves are part of, that's a big one. And just sort of, as this market grows, it's not simply nature-based solutions. There's other technologies that are out there, particularly energy efficiency, industrial gases. There's cook stoves in developing countries and the like, but sort of a broader mainstreaming of carbon markets, again, in a way then that we just haven't seen. And to be clear, the carbon markets are still minuscule in a $1 trillion global carbon market. 900 million of that is compliance markets, mostly the European emissions trading scheme. The voluntary market's $3 billion, but the growth forecasts just over the last couple of years and going forward are sort of your quintessential hockey stick. So a lot of growth to be expected there, and therein, I think a lot of opportunities for folks in the room that are stewards of the land, and are looking for opportunities to develop a revenue stream from that land that doesn't necessarily involve extractive industries, or is in conjunction with those types of industries.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
Jason, you want to add to that?
For trends, yeah, I mentioned the few of the offset market in BC, and then federally, there's also at a macro level, the Corsia agreement, the agreement from the feds, and still some questions there as where is the placement of those? How is there an Indigenous lens on that project to ensure that if there are going to be potentially carbon offsets in the future from that, how nations are going to play a role? Some of the challenges, as was mentioned, is the Crown land issue, private lands issue, land lease issue. And from my upbringing or from my worldview, the comments have always been said, Crown land is not Crown land. There's impacts there. There's far beyond the compliance of duty to consult. There's a stronger requirement now to ensure that nations are driving some of that process related to development. And there's just many challenges in the forest sector when it comes to that across jurisdictions, but we are seeing certain ministries work in collaboration to open the door to forced tenure movement, and also some of the consuming metals now that are going to be required to work in partnership with the nation. So if there are going to be offsets on Crown land, nations should be a part of driving that process and reopening that discussion for an atmosphere's benefit sharing agreement similar to the Great Bear Rainforest out west that could be potentially a model for other Crown land projects and forest management. Few in Ontario being pursued. There's still some challenges there with jurisdiction. And overall, I think with the market or the carbon market environment it just seems to be too focused on the buyer cherry picking the right or the project at the lowest price that meets some of their checklist criteria. So if there's an opportunity for nations to drive a model that disrupts the system, that changes how certain selection processes are made related to projects, then we'll see more projects, more meaningful projects funded rather than the lower cost project that just meets companies' criteria.
Well, on that note, based on that perspective, and then when you take into consideration what we've talked about earlier with the ESG component, how are companies going to be able to capitalize on that in respect to First Nations?
If that related to that model, if there's support for purchasing from nations and nations are able to pool supply of potential carbon offsets, then they're able to then average that price across the system, across a portfolio. And if there's more nations that are involving their carbon offsets in a portfolio, but that price is average, then there'll be a buyer-seller system that could potentially support that same price no matter what the project costs are. So you'll see mainly, forest management projects happening or certain offsets where there is a criteria to support that, but there'll be influence to support other wetland restoration or habitat for communities that go out and access traditional lands for specific purposes, harvesting medicine, harvesting moose, or being out on the land and so forth. So we'll see a system that's based off of more alignment with First Nations land use and cultural values, but also where First Nations are leading in regulating that price, regulating that market. And that's a value add for buyers as well, from an ESG reporting perspective, to disclose that in your audit and financial statements, that you're working within a portfolio that leverages community interest that's First Nation led. I think that's where we need to go related to the future of that and to support that average price that eliminates the.
That's US. $20 at the higher end is typically a nature-based solution. I just got pricing today for a forestry project in China, $13 US, but it is an OTC market. It's pretty heterogeneous based on the underlying, and so it's hard for me to say, what price point a particular corporate will enter the market at. From my perspective, just thinking about the growth of the market and what's needed to scale it, as long as they're in the market, I think that's a net win, because the more that are in the market, the more that's going to drive demand, and then what you should see, depending on how supply responds, is that you should see an uptick in price, bringing more supply online and higher value for those then that already have projects. Again, emphasizing, I guess, that the market still is very, very small. It is purely OTC. You're starting to see some products trade on exchange, but that's probably more of a future thing as the market grows and becomes more liquid.
For people that don't understand what OTC is, can you?
Transacting bilaterally. So going out and finding a counterparty and entering into a bilateral agreement with them. So for example, in TD's case, when we contracted for the Boreal Wildlands project, we contracted bilaterally, so directly with the Nature Conservancy, as opposed to anonymously, potentially through an exchange, how you'd normally transact a stock or a bond.
Okay, thank you. So you've covered a lot, which is great. But I'm sure there's some thoughts and ideas that you have that I didn't ask in the form of a question. So I'm going to give, starting with Jason, an opportunity to really provide the audience with what other final thoughts or ideas that, in respect to our audience here, that you want to share.
Sure. I think the other part of the equation, we talked a lot about the buyer supply side of things, forest tenure, reallocation, and nations looking to develop the long-term land relationship plan, land development plan, and where carbon or nature-based solutions could potentially sit within the community's socioeconomic interests, and planning for that is important. But also the seed funding to get those projects going is where government needs to come to the table to offer these types of projects to, to advance some of the studies and some of the planning. When it comes to thinking of what could be done as well at a high level, is we see nations planning for the IPCAs, the Indigenous Protected Conservation Areas, and under current criteria, those are ineligible for carbon offset. So having a shift in the mentality to support more of the offset opportunities for IPCAs would be an easy win for nations to, and for a rising tide for all boats, of course, to see that being supported by government, to see IPCAs be in the carbon offset market opportunity to diversify companies' interests and their investments into a nation's project. The other is what government could do is to guarantee some of the programming in the future related to the market for First Nation-led projects. And if government could guarantee the financing mechanism, we'll see the insurance companies come to the table to also ensure the projects from carbon reversal or those issues. So those are the other two important parts of the equation, is the government and the insurance companies as well, and the lenders, of course.
Thank you. Andrew.
So, I think one of the interesting things about attending sort of a grassroots event like this is the market is growing fast. You guys are by no means behind. Actually, I'm surprised that and kudos to the organizers for putting together an event like this at this particular stage in the market. But I think you're sort of at the upward growth trajectory point in the market. So to the extent then that the carbon markets seem like an appropriate fit for whatever growth or economic strategy that you have, I think now is a good time to start to consider where offsets might fit into that and what the opportunities are within sort of a broader opportunity suite, and to start to look for partners to help you develop that. There's a ton of material out there. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of firms that are rapidly emerging, again, to capitalize on the space. So a certain amount of due diligence is important as you go out and begin to think about potentially developing projects or partnering with somebody. So I just put that out there. That's natural with any type of rapidly growing market. But overall, again, just within the public domain, there's lots of information then that folks can use to begin to develop a sort of a better understanding of the markets and where they might potentially fit within it. You can start to go out and develop assessments of the lands that you have and what the potential opportunity might be therein. As was mentioned earlier, the federal government is coming out with a forestry protocol. Then it's very, very delayed. So when it's going to be released is TBD, and how commercially applicable it will be is also one to watch. But in the meantime, there are voluntary markets and standards then that you can look at. There's 4 main voluntary standards that most offset projects, ours included, are developed under. So you can begin to get a sense of what the value of an offset project might be. And then again, as that federal standard or protocol emerges, then you can anticipate probably much higher prices, given where the federal carbon price is at and where it's mandated to go. It could make a lot of projects of a lot of different stripes economic very quickly. So,
and of course, our focus is the voluntary market, so that bodes well for everyone in this room. We do have some questions from the audience. You guys okay with taking a couple? I've got them right here. Is there a financing problem for carbon projects as of today?
I'll just hop in and say, the comments I made around the buyer influencing much of the market is showing that the market today is failing to support or advance First Nation-led projects, and that's where First Nations could have more influence on the market, is pooling supply and potentially piloting projects to show some leadership in there without too much influence from the intermediaries as well. And the other part, to get things going from not just the financing, but I mentioned the grant side of things. Nature United is establishing First Nations or Indigenous programs specifically for Indigenous projects. It was some pro bono work that we did to support them because we've seen a gap in the market that there wasn't necessarily a program that was focused on Indigenous-led projects. So we wanted to develop a financing mechanism to get communities in the door and get their projects in queue and get that thinking going. So that's another area, but there could be more support across Canada for those types of programs as well.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, historically, it's been simple. There's been no money for any projects, and now it's the case that what I'm seeing is more capital looking for projects. So it's kind of flipped on its head. Carbon finance is kind of the base mechanism then that's used for the development of projects where the land, for example, has to be acquired, as was the case with us in the Nature Conservancy. So we prepaid for those offsets, and that allowed them to go out then and acquire the land. I expect that'll be a model that will be replicated. Again, if the lands are already owned and it's just simply a matter of developing the projects, then financing is obviously less of an issue beyond sort of those capital costs to have, bring in consultants and run the project to the different registries and standards and the like. But you're starting to see it mainstreamed. Again, as this market grows, you're starting to see more traditional sources of capital, private equity or banks, that are looking to be involved in the market. And so I think it's certainly, again, historically has been a problem, and it probably, again, depending, could be. But I think it's, as the market matures, it's becoming less of an issue.
Okay. This question is for you, Andrew.
Yeah.
Is there a priority for environmental or social license or governance when you talk to buyers?
So it's totally dependent on the buyer, right? Because of the underlying in the carbon offset market is so different from project to project to project. So in the case of an industrial gas destruction project, there isn't a lot of social anything. You incinerate, fluorocarbons, so refrigerants. That really comes into play when you get into nature-based solutions, where that has a role. But I think first and foremost, I mean, people are focused on the GHG emissions and to an extent, what is the cost then of that offset that's yielding that reduction. Second then, and it's only slightly lower priority are any sort of social benefits, and that's why you're seeing nature-based solutions really be a priority right now as folks are looking for projects that are, the term is charismatic, that have benefits beyond sequestering the carbon. I think when you have good E and good S, that's a reflection of good G. So good governance tends to yield the first two, broadly speaking. But thinking about offsets, I think focus on the E, followed by closely by the S, and then the G is, again, I think intrinsic to that.
Thank you. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Do we have more?
Can I ask one question as well, please? Thank you very much.
We're going to give you a live mic here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Hi, Andrew. You spoke about co-benefits, and I thought that was a great introduction to that based on forestry. You spoke on an example of co-benefits on forestry. We have today First Nations represented in the room that are quite significantly nature-based and agricultural, of course, here representing hundreds of thousands of acres of agricultural farmland that will be farmed regeneratively. It will be farmed in a way where the biomass index is improving, the biological counts are improving. The land will be farmed in an identity preserved basis where it's recorded. The data will be recorded. So we're selling hard ourselves and our future customers in the OTC that you talk about, our ability to sell these ESG credits, on the fact that the co-benefit is this land will be farmed better. This land will be regenerative, which means that every year it will accretively produce more, which is the real definition of regenerative land. And that really meets the final mission of First Nations, because we simply pass land, they simply pass land on from generation to generation. So, so co-benefit. Speak to other elements of co-benefit that maybe you can speak to. You mentioned a few in forestry. I've just mentioned one in agriculture. Is there anything else that you can speak to that we could put our hands around and help our vision and our mission going forward?
So maybe just touching on ag credits first. I mean, the interesting thing about that, it's kind of been rebranded, but in the Alberta system, I'm based in Calgary, and Alberta has had a compliance offset system since 2007, and the single largest source of offsets in that program since inception has been low and no-till, which is now called a nature-based solution or regenerative ag. But as you said, right, it's premised on then changing techniques to improve not only the soil sequestration, but increasing then obviously the carbon content, but water retention, reduced erosion, and the like are other co-benefits, such that over time you should see the soil start to return to maybe how it traditionally was in terms of its ability to support crops. Again, co-benefits. I think the main thing is looking beyond then, in the context of a carbon offsets, looking beyond the GHG reduction or removal. So again, water is a big one. Biodiversity is a big one. I think traditional land uses, like folks are, particularly in Canada, but I think globally, and you heard Fiona from BHP mention that, are looking for ways then to partner with, again, the traditional users of that land as a key co-benefit. And probably that's only emerged in the last 2 to 3 years, but I don't think then the enthusiasm for that and the motivation then of buyers to make sure that that's part and parcel of their project can be underestimated. It is, and people will pay more, right? All else being equal, if you have forestry project A, forestry project B, one has 5 co-benefits, the other has 2. Probably a buyer that's not necessarily price sensitive is going to look towards the one that has more co-benefits, and particularly those that allow partnerships, again, with traditional users of the land.
We do have another question. The mic is, our friends can hear your magnificent question. Oh, we got another one.
Test.
Oh,
Now you're ready.
Hey, yelling around here. Yeah, just a real quick question. I guess just for clarification for those that are fairly new, and looking at potential projects that are based on forestry versus those projects that might be based on agriculture. Would you maybe be able to share a little bit about the differentiation between how those two are regarded, the difference between them in the market? Either or.
take it. Either one, sure. We'll probably get both of you to answer that.
Want to go first?
Sure. So again, all else being equal, including price, I think most people would choose the forestry project just simply because of the charisma of it. Oftentimes companies, then they're buying offsets, particularly if they're making large commitments or long-term commitments, will feature then that project or a description of that project in their ESG or sustainability report. And so even just optically, the picture of a nice rainforest on the West Coast looks better than a piece of flat land, even if, from a carbon perspective, it's maybe net is the same. So I would say that, but in terms of, the broader market where maybe cost will play a bit more of a role. Again, as this thing scales, you're going to have buyers that don't care about the price because they don't have a lot of emissions, and then you're going to have people with millions of tons of emissions then that are going to be a little bit more price sensitive or looking to put together a portfolio, some forestry, some industrial reduction, some ag based, where you might see them then be more more willing to buy the ag project over the forestry project. But again, looked at purely, I mean, it's global warming, right? So all else being equal, as long as the carbon reduction is the same, one shouldn't care. But just like some people will choose a high-end car versus a regular car, despite them both being modes of transportation, like there's buyer preference in that way. So I guess that's how I'd frame it up right now. But certainly there is a price differentiation in the market right now.
I think Jason wants to add to that.
Yeah, just wanted to add when I view the forestry projects that are being put forward, a lot of it is looked at as kind of the species that are there, and from a carbon accounting perspective, how those species are potentially contributing to offsetting some of the carbon. Specifically, if I had to think of an area in Northern Ontario with the boreal forests and some of the discussions that are happening from adapting forest management planning to include an Indigenous lens or integrating Indigenous traditional knowledge in that long-term forest management planning process. If there's opportunities to do that in the agriculture space, to think of how the landscape is considered, how methods of agriculture are being performed, and to include an Indigenous lens in that perspective, then there could be more co-benefits, more than just the biodiversity factors that you see a lot of ministries utilize as their key performance indicator. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, gentlemen, you certainly have provided us with a lot to think about, some great information that we didn't have before. And as you said, this is continuing to evolve. And I think that there's no question that when we look at climate change and the discussion today, I think we're all going to benefit from the learning. So thank you very much. To show our appreciation, got to make sure I don't fall off my stool here. Again, Indigenious, Carol Ann Hilton, who you're going to hear about later. This is her book. It's a fantastic book on the topic Indigenous economics. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to turn the mic back to Mr. Lionel Cambites.
Thank you very much, Pat. Job well done. Jason and Andrew, fantastic job. Your phone will be ringing. I've got a few more questions for you, so thank you so much. Nice to see experts in the field. Before we break for our networking session, I'd like to call on a good friend and a true champion of the environment, the first person that I ever had a discussion with where he coined the phrase environmental sovereignty. And this was 5 or 6 years ago, and we've challenged each other for the right moment for this to happen and to come, and been a motivating factor in our lives here in seeing First Nations succeed, seeing First Nations empower themselves environmentally and empower themselves with the value of their land, the very lands. Retired Chief Reginald Belrose. Chief Reginald, prior to just retiring, was a chief for 17 consecutive years, and his family has held positions of chiefdom, I call them positions of being the chief, for over 90 years in this province. He's very well recognized, an outstanding spokesman for the entire arena of economic development in First Nations. I'd like to call on Chief Reg Belrose.
Thank you very much, Lionel. Greetings, Anine, Danse. Before I start, I just want to ask the chiefs to stand up. There's a lot of this and that. Maybe you don't know who the chiefs are. Can you stand up, chiefs? If you've been a chief or you're a chief, we got Chief Janai over there, Treaty 4. My right-hand man, Chief Francis from Niganit. Yeah, these are the men and women. Chief Woodhouse. Yeah, please. Yeah, so these are the types of they're not. Nobody's Superman or Superwoman. They're just regular people who take on these extraordinary roles. So I just want to maybe we can give them a round of applause. Maybe the next one we could ask the counselors to stand up. The Facebook warriors, I won't, the whole room will, no, just kidding. So here's the elected council that work to support the leadership. So when you say government, this is the ones that make up First Nation government. So round of applause for them. Yeah, thank you for attending. You know, part of the opportunity, just share a little bit. So when we were negotiating treaty land entitlement in Saskatchewan, Roland Crow was the chief of FSIN, and he brought in Lloyd Barber, he brought in all these experts. He looked in a room like this, he said, if I'm the smartest man in this room, we're in big trouble, he said. So, and the point is, you know, the First Nations, they're actually not stakeholders, they're rights holders. They're the first rights holders of this land. I disagree with Bob Ray a little bit that in Treaty 4, we actually don't need the UN Declaration. We have Treaty 4, which protects who we are as Indians, living our way the way we always have, whether it's 4 or 6 or 2 or 10. That's what the treaty is. And Lionel's a partner who's been able to understand the rights that we have through lands, people, all because of our histories. So as we talk about breaking into a market, establishing a market, it's much easier. So if you look at gaming, Bernie Shepherd was chief in White Bear. He had to, you know, face the army coming in and pointing guns and rifles at them so we could get into the gaming market. It wasn't handed to us. Leaders had to take a stand somewhere. And then so you look fast forward 25 years, First Nations owned the entire online market in Saskatchewan for sports and online betting. But it all started way back in White Bear when they faced the assault rifles, trying to say, and them ladies who stood there, all they said is, we want our kids to work. We want our kids to work. Nobody wants welfare in Indian country. We want opportunity, we want education, we want training, all of that good stuff. But what makes it work so well is we bring our rights collectively. Fishing Lake, Daystar, Niganit, Muskaugan. We all have individual rights, but as we come together in collective rights, we become a force. That's how SIGA stands. All 74 First Nations own. The opportunity here is to bring our lands collectively together to stand. Because you're going to hear from TD, thank you for your comments earlier. Everybody is stuck in a provincial or crown. They forget about us. And the reason we have all these rights is not because of Treaty 4, it's because of our inherent rights. Sheldon helped a family, an agriculture family. They went by science. 10,000 years, the science proved we've been here. The ancient cultures of India and China, they have science dating back 5,000 years. So to the ancient cultures, they're just kids to us because we've been here for 10,000 years. So that's how we get all of these rights and privileges and opportunities. And through the AFN run last year, I heard a couple things across the country. One is climate change. We don't need anybody to give us guidance. We need people to listen to us. You in these chairs, people need to listen to you. So what we did here with Carbon is we created 2 functions. One is an Elder Advisory Council. So we're not just going to say, well, we're here because we want to partner with First Nations. No, we want our elders to come in and share their knowledge. That's key. The second thing is we created an advisory council, which would help bring in expertise, influencers from across Canada to help share who are we, what do we want. You know, you heard Jason from Deloitte. He explained it very, very clearly. Everybody is missing the boat. We got to get on the boat, and people like Lionel, he's a good partner. What's going to differentiate Carbon and from other opportunities is the trust. I know what it comes down to. You can have all the decks and the pitch documents you want, but you have to trust. First Nations have to trust who they're going to work with. So we're trying to bring that trust factor to the rooms like this. And you know, we heard from Fiona. Fiona didn't invest in Saskatchewan. Fiona invested in Treaty 4 territory. That's our perspective. Everyone says, well, thank God they came to Saskatchewan. We're like, well, we're happy they came to Treaty 4. That's just different perspectives. It's not controversial or adversarial. It's just the perspective of a First Nation mindset. That's all it is. So I hope no one takes offense to as the leaders and people start to bring forward our vision, what we want. And I learned pretty clearly from a treaty conference we had in Muskowgan, 2 things. And a lot of these elders have passed on. One is we need to unite, we need to stand together. And second is we need to make our own laws. Because as nations, we have to make our own laws. Elder Irvin Buffalo, all these elders, a lot of them are gone now. So in this type of venue, those online, appreciate you joining and taking an interest into the leaders here. I hope we can stand together because we don't want to just make a show of force in Saskatchewan or Canada. Through our treaty and inherent rights, we have the ability to be international presence, international markets, establish ourselves internationally. But your present demand of I need a home, I need a door, my toilet's broken, all of that, it consumes your time as leaders. Had a lot of those calls myself. I still get heck from people when I see them remember when I phoned you about my door, you never fixed it. Yeah, that doesn't go away. So during this networking time, I hope we cross over. I hope leaders aren't in this corner and everyone's in that. Let's get together. Let's do some crossover as we chat and share and work together, but also seize opportunity. If you haven't signed, sign. There's one way to do it, and I got myself in a lot of heck over it. I didn't talk implementation. I implemented. Talking and implementing get leaders in a heck of a lot of trouble. But, you know, I'd rather get heck for doing something than get heck for doing nothing. That's how you last in politics. So, simple rule. Thank you for your time, and to the Carbon RX team who helped coordinate, organize. Thank you. It's been a, learning opportunity. Government's here as well. Lots of, Lionel, thanks for everything, and we'll keep plugging away. Have a good rest of the session.
Thank you very much, Chief Reg. Inspiring as always. I can listen to you for and have listened to you for many, many years, and I thank you so much for your words of wisdom and inspiration. And it's a great idea. We're networking right now. We're going to break for about a half an hour. We're going to be able to get together and chat with one another, but let's take that advice from the Chief. Let's be sure that every one of our First Nations leaders is surrounded by 6 non-First Nations leaders, getting to know each other, getting their perspectives on what we have to accomplish and what we're going to accomplish moving forward. So with that, we'll take a break and we'll see you back here at 3:30, and let's make sure we can do a good job of mixing. Thank you very much. Good. All right.